Hello everyone, it's Silver. This is Keylocker. So the second part to our Moonana special that we're doing involves their newest game. This is a cyberpunk RPG that is taking a lot of cues from Virgo Versus the Zodiac, but is definitely going in its own direction. So rather than the more celestial themes that their previous game had, this time we're firmly in sci-fi cyberpunk territory with some really strange writing and stuff that is reminiscent of the previous game's writing, but is also a lot more focused on, I would say, messages like sort of self-worth, as well as loss and like general just freedom, being free to do what you want to do, being a free spirit, being creative. So this is a strange world in which music has been banned because it generates electricity somehow. And the people that generate the electricity want to control it and don't want just anyone to be able to have it. So they've banned all music, and now you will play as a person who actually has a band. And that is, of course, highly illegal in this world. And you go on a trip to not only play music and bring music to more people's ears, because most people have never heard it, but also to sort of break down the system that put this restriction into place and originally. So in terms of how it looks, it definitely does look quite a bit different from their previous game, both in terms of overall style and definitely in terms of color palette. It's still somewhat chunky pixel art, but it is a lot more high-resolution pixel art this time, so a little bit less of the big chunks. Character models are much more detailed, and animations are smoother and more visible this time because of the extra detail on the characters. But I think the thing that benefits it from the most is the environment art. The environment art in this game is far more complex and a lot more detailed than it was before. And this fits with the game's mechanics as well, because the overall exploration areas are much larger and more detailed as well. They're more complicated to go through, and the dungeons of the game get a lot more complicated as well. So it fits that with this increase in scale, there's also an increase in visual detail to go along with it. You also have those more detailed character models, the up-close portraits and character cut-ins and things, just like the previous game had. Although in this case, the style they're going for is vastly different. This is a lot more of like a 90s anime kind of look to it. Some like 90s cyberpunk and overall sci-fi anime. I think I'm seeing some influence from stuff like Ghost in the Shell and Akira, possibly. But also, interestingly, some of the areas and some of the other characters also have more of a modern cyberpunk anime influence, so you'll be seeing stuff that might remind you of, say, Blame. Overall, it's a really nice art style, and I really like it, and the color palette is interesting because it's got a lot of high contrast, bright, vivid colors, like a lot of cyberpunk media does, especially greens and purples. But just like in Virgo Versus the Zodiac, the real star of the show is the music, and you would kind of hope that that would be the case in a game that is literally about music, but yeah, the music in this game is really, really good. Even better, I think, than the previous game. It has a fantastic soundtrack that is a mix of all kinds of electronic elements, as well as a lot of like just synth, general like cyberpunk acid synth and stuff, and a lot of really heavy percussion mixed in there. It's a really, really lovely soundtrack. This is one of the soundtracks that's going to go like on my Spotify or on my playlist to actually listen to just on a regular basis while I'm editing and doing other stuff, because it really is that good. It's just so good. And a lot of the exploration tracks are more chill and have a really interesting kind of, well, they take the visual vibe of that area and do a good job of translating it into music. But in addition to those, there's also the boss fight and combat soundtracks, which are much more upbeat and kind of advanced in terms of the number of instruments and stuff, and are just more aggressive in general. So mechanically, this game is easily as complex as the previous, maybe even a little bit more so in terms of building your characters and things, but it also uses a very different system of everything, stats and mechanics and stuff, it all works differently. The previous game used a rock, paper, scissors like 3 stat system. This instead uses a sort of opposing system where everything has some sort of opposite. So rather than a group of 3, you'll have multiple groups of 2. So you have things like your life points and your electricity points that you've got to manage in opposition to each other oftentimes. And you've also got your dissonance and your resonance, which are your sort of offense and defense stats. You've also got your attack versus your defense specific stats. And even all of these status effects work this way, where each effect is actually a group of 2 that oppose each other. So there's a positive and a negative status effect, and they cancel each other out if they ever meet on the battlefield. So you've got 4 slots for equipment and 4 slots in battle that you can use with the D-pad like before, and they are a life and an electric attack and defense, one of each. And the electric stuff is for generating electricity, which you need to do the life stuff. So your electric attack generates some electricity by stealing it from enemies. You would attack them, reduce their electricity, and you get a percentage of the damage you deal as electricity for yourself. And if they run out of electricity, then the damage bleeds over into their health gauge. And your electric defense move is some sort of electricity generating skill, usually playing an instrument that causes you to generate some electricity for yourself and other allies near you, as well as set you up for a counterattack. If you get hit directly after you use this, then you'll automatically counter. But once you have a good amount of electricity, you want to use your life skills. So your life defense, you have to hold the A button down, and it will drain your electricity as long as you hold it to power up the attack, whichever one you're doing. And if you keep draining your electricity for the defense, then it'll give you an armor meter that gets longer and longer the more you drain. And this will just take damage instead of your health gauge for as long as you have it. But if you manage to perfect time a defense, so an enemy attacks you and you perfect time it to where it misses, then you will counterattack with a really powerful counter, and you will burn the rest of the armor that you still have to increase the damage of the counter, and this can easily one-shot all the enemies around you if you're positioned correctly. And the life attack is the same sort of thing. You hold the button down to drain your electricity into an attack that gathers more and more damage as the more electricity you pour into it, until finally you release this big heavy attack that, again, if you time it right, will often one-shot whatever it hits. So timed hits are central to this combat system, just like they were in the previous game, but I would argue they're even more important in this game than they were previously, because previously they allowed you to do extra damage or take less damage, but they're much more powerful this time around. If you get a perfect timed hit, you do way more damage than if you get a miss or you just get an okay by almost hitting it perfectly, but not quite. Yeah, the perfect timed hits are just way stronger, and the same goes for the defense. If you perfect time a defense, you take no damage at all. So that's a huge difference. It can often be the difference between getting immediately killed by an enemy's opening attack or taking absolutely no damage. So this means you need to really get used to the timed hits of every weapon and enemy in the game, because you need to perfect them in order to actually do well. It does make sense, I think, for a game all about music to have a heavily rhythm-based mechanic that's completely central to its combat. This time around, the main types of timed hits are either directional buttons or pressing a button with the right timing, and the right timing is usually indicated by something flashing. So if you are doing an attack, then your character will flash, and you have to hit the button right as they flash, and if an enemy is attacking you, then at some point during their attack animation, they'll flash, and that's when you want to defend. The thing about these is, though, that flash is like a teeny tiny fraction of a second long. It's really fast. So you've got to basically know that it's coming already. Most of the time, you will miss the first time an enemy uses a new attack because you won't know the timing for it, and trying to just react, just have it pure reaction timing, you're not fast enough most of the time. So instead, you've got to actually know when this is going to happen because you've seen the attack before. Like, as far as I go, I'd like to think relatively good reaction time, but the timed hits in this game are really fast, to the point that most of the time I miss them if I don't already know what the timing is. Like the first time I'm seeing a new enemy or something, I'll usually miss their attacks until I figure out the timing by just looking and watching and seeing what happens, because they are that precise. All of the timed hits in this game are incredibly quick and really highly precise. This means that overall, I think this game is actually more difficult than the previous game because of this, because the timed hits are much harder to hit this time around, and they're also much more important to hit. The combat is on a grid, I should also mention. It's a sort of big grid-based thing where you can shuffle around between turns and then position for various attacks, and each of your weapons will have a different range to it that you need to get within in order to hit the enemies with whatever you're looking to hit them with. So positioning is very important, and you will always have two characters once you get to a certain point in the game's story. You got two characters in your party. You've also got a class system. There are 4 different classes, 2 offensive and 2 defensive classes, and you can choose 2 different characters' classes. Everyone else has a set class, but the 2 sort of main characters, you can choose theirs. And there's a lot of equipment variety this time around, just like last time, but you get it slower. In the previous game, you often got a lot of equipment pretty early on, so you had a lot to fill the slots with from a pretty early point. This game does not work that way. It'll take you a couple of chapters before you really start finding lots of equipment. So there's still plenty of building potential and a lot of build variety. It's just that it takes a little bit longer to get there. This game is on a bit of a slower burn. Also, something interesting about the equipment is that most of it can be put in multiple different slots. You will usually not find a piece of equipment that only does one thing. Usually there's at least 2, sometimes 3 slots that the piece can be put in, and it'll do a different attack or have a different capability depending on where you actually put it, which is a really neat idea, and it expands the overall equipment variety without needing to fill your inventory with as much stuff, because everything has like double or triple uses. I would say overall, the combat in this game is really fun. It's got a lot of moving parts, it's pretty complex and highly reliant on rhythm, but it's also very lethal. It doesn't take very long. You're not going to be in like a slog combat that lasts for 10 or 15 minutes. That just doesn't happen. Even against really tough bosses, they tend to die really fast, and so do you. Pretty much everything in this game dies really fast. So combat doesn't take very long. It's more about positioning and tactics and timed hits than it is about hitting yourself against really huge health gauges over and over. The way that status effects work in this game is also a little bit unusual. There is a stat called Influence that actually affects how powerful the various buffs and debuffs are, but also they have 2 different types. There's analog and digital buffs and debuffs. Digital effects apply directly to an enemy or you, depending on who gets hit by it, and they apply to that character instantly whenever they're used, whereas analog effects attach themselves to a hex on the board, a tile, and they affect whoever is currently standing there, friend or foe. So that's another thing that adds an interesting layer to the combat. And there's also the fact that if you're fighting some of the main bosses, the big villains that you're going to be fighting at the ends of chapters and stuff, they are able to sync together, which has this really cool screen that happens, sort of cut in before it happens, and then they sync together and a big red line appears between them, and they become completely invincible. And you've got to stand and interrupt that red line wherever it moves in order to be able to do any damage to them, but as long as a character is standing there, they take damage every turn. So you've got to kind of be careful about swapping them out and stuff, and making sure that someone is always standing in this line to make sure you can do damage to them. Mechanics like this, and the general prevalence of timed hits and everything, it makes the boss fights feel like dances, kind of. The leveling system is also unusual. There's no experience in this game. You don't gain experience from killing enemies and level up. Instead, you gain keys, and you spend these keys on a class-specific skill tree that has all sorts of different stuff in it. It's a really big skill tree, and you can spend an increasing number of keys to unlock new nodes in it, and each time you unlock a new one, your level will go up by 1. So your level is actually related to how many nodes you've purchased rather than anything else. Each class has a lot of stuff on this tree, from nodes that directly enhance specific weapon types and make them more powerful, to just general stat increases that usually also have a stat decrease along with them, passive effects that apply to all of your certain kinds of attacks and stuff, and also there are these skill programs that you can slot into one of your 4 directional slots, and they will affect whatever skill is in that slot whenever you use it, imbuing it with some extra effects. Kind of like an enchantment or something like that. And also, as a little bit of added gameplay variety, there are moments where, because you are in a band, you have to play a concert, and it's basically Guitar Hero. The screen fills up in a very Guitar Hero-like interface, and you use the shoulder buttons on a controller. I'm not sure what the bindings are on keyboard, but on a controller it's the 4 shoulder buttons, and you use those to play notes and chords in a very, like, Clone Hero style. These have fantastic music. They actually have multiple versions of the tracks because you can play it in Saturnian or in English, and it actually changes the lyrics, which is a really cool touch. And they also have 4 different difficulties that you can choose to play them at. So if you're not very good at that sort of thing and you don't really care about that part, then you can just put it on easy, and it's still not the easiest thing in the world, but it is easier, much easier. Whereas if you enjoy this kind of rhythm minigame and you want to be challenged, then there are higher difficulties for you to try as well. And they're really satisfying to pull off, and you can even change the note lag in like 5 millisecond increments and stuff to match with your screen and controller and whatever else you have that may add latency, so that it feels very precise and accurate. Story-wise, there's a pretty interesting tale being told here, I think, because of those themes I mentioned earlier, and the overall sort of feeling of the story is... It's cyberpunk. It's recognizably cyberpunk, but it's also different. In a lot of ways, it's a lot more digital instead of the usual sort of physical cyberpunk. This is sort of like a digital world, and you're playing as doppelgangers, which are sort of like cyborgs. And there seems to be a pretty significant conspiracy happening in terms of what the Emperor is doing and what some of the other satellites are doing, which are like the sort of leaders of the different areas of this big system set up around Saturn. I'll admit I tend to be a fan of just about any story that has heavy themes of rebellion and of some sort of going against the status quo. I think those are usually really fun stories, and this game definitely does that. I mean, it's a classic story, the whole, music as a way to rebel against the man sort of thing, right? Like, that goes back a long way, but it's usually not done in a cyberpunk setting, so that makes it pretty interesting here. They did also keep a couple of things from Virgo Versus the Zodiac that are very important. For one, enemies do still fly across the screen and explode if you do a perfect timed hit on them. That's very important. And also, Save Dinosaur is back. Save Dinosaur is needed, he's necessary, and the fact that he does exist in the world and other characters mention him means that he is definitely canon. Also, this game uses a really interesting save system that I've never seen before, and I think is really, really cool, and it's probably only possible in an indie game like this where the file sizes are going to be smaller, because the way that it works is whenever you save in the same slot and choose to overwrite it, it doesn't actually overwrite it, but instead allows you to scroll between all of the saves you've made in that slot. It keeps all of them. So even if you're saving in the same 1 or 2 slots, you actually have a record of all of your saves going back for every time you saved. That's really cool. I've never seen that before, and I would like to see something like that again in other RPGs, where you have all these various states that you can return to because it has kept all of your saves. Overall, I've really, really enjoyed my time with Keylocker, and I'm going to continue playing it. It is really fun to have on the Steam Deck. It works perfectly there, and is just the art style and everything. It looks really good on like a small, sharp screen, so I'm a fan of that. I really like the story this time around. I definitely identify with a lot of the themes, and I like a lot of the characters. And the overall off-kilter, strange writing is still here, but it's a little bit more understandable, a little bit more coherent this time around in terms of like character motivation and stuff, especially with the big villains and the main characters, what they want to do, their sort of overarching goal. So I have no problem recommending Virgo Versus the Zodiac in the last video, and I have even less of a problem recommending Keylocker. It is a fantastic indie RPG that shows the kinds of heights that you can be pushed to as a small team, making something with a lot of passion and interest. You create some really cool stuff like this. And this is going to be another one of those memorable RPGs that I come back to every now and then because of its just sort of unique vibe that it gives off. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Keylocker if you wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.